Welcome to Recovery with Root, a podcast centered on topics surrounding mental health and addiction. Through our Advanced Recovery Institute, a new entity of the Root Center for Advanced Recovery, we are committed to research and training to elevate clinical care. We hope you find this podcast informative, and most of all, we hope that it helps improve the lives of others. Remember, we're in this together, and recovery is possible.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Recovery with Root. My name's Margot Farrell, Chief of Staff here at the Root Center for Advanced Recovery, joined by Dr. Karen Kangas. She is a woman in long-term recovery. She is a professor. She has struggled with her own mental health issues, and she is here to tell us all about her story. Karen, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I am so excited. I think you are probably the most colorful guest we've ever had on the show.
I know. I've heard that before, too.
And I can already tell, just based on that, you can tell a lot. I had a professor in journalism school who said, always find somebody who has a funny hat or some type of very cool accessory, and they'll be a great interview.
Wow, that's interesting. Oh, my gosh.
And I said, well, there's a lot that I could ask you about your outfit. And I just want to start first and foremost with a little bit about your story. So tell me where you think that begins, Karen.
Well, I think I could just tell you a little bit about where I grew up, which is not about recovery, because I think one of the things that was really interesting about my career is I was in education, and I grew up in Montana, and my father was extremely famous. He's deceased, he's still famous. He's probably the most winningest basketball coach in Montana history.
Wow.
So, sports was the thing. And probably I got a lot from that because there was a lot of win. And winning is kind of like recovery. You're going to win. You're going to be, it's really easy for me to give hope because I know there's a win there. You're going to be okay. And I can think of that, my father was this coach that brought in music and all kinds of different things, but his story, he put a little town of Sidney, Montana, where I went to elementary school, on the map because of basketball. And when I went back to my reunions, they would all be interested a little bit in me, but really, what is your father doing? And let's talk about your father. But so it was kind of nice that I got out of Montana, and I actually went to the it's now called the University of Montana at Billings, Montana, and I got a degree in education. And when I went to register for college, I thought, well, I think I'll take I think I'm going to be an English teacher. And then I looked at the curriculum, and it said, you're going to have to take speech the first quarter. And I thought it was quarters, not semesters then. So I said, speech? Oh, I don't know that I could be giving speeches. And I think that's ironic because when I started in this field of recovery, I was giving speeches 7 times a week, every night, in every place, everywhere, wherever I was invited, because it was just the thing to tell people there is recovery because they did not know. And especially in mental health, addiction had a little bit of a head start with recovery. And I think we kind of borrowed from them in terms of mental health because we didn't talk about recovery. We talked about, taking your meds and you might live, but, you got to really be, you're not going to ever be not taking medication. Mm-hmm. And I'm pleased to say that I don't take medication for mental health right now, but that's because of all the other things I've learned. So anyway, I started and I went to elementary education, and I got through and my parents had just moved from Bozeman, Montana, where my father was the head basketball coach, to the head basketball coach at a brand new school in Billings, Montana, Billings West High. And I said, my parents were building a new house. I said, you know what, I'll stay home, and I'll just run down the street. It's not run down the street, it's a few miles down the street, and certainly drove, but and go to school there. And I finished my bachelor's in 3 years because I thought, you know what, I'm going to just do it and get out, and then I'm going to go to someplace else and so when I graduated from college in 3 years with honors, I was asked to go. I got offers in California and in the state of Washington. And I decided to go to the state of Washington because a friend that I didn't really know real well, she was a year older, but she was going to go, and we both went to Tacoma, Washington. And of course we spent weekends in Seattle, and it was a neat thing because I like the city. And that has to do with why I like clothes too, because Montana wears jeans and the cowboy boots, and of course now I love the cowboy boots because it's kind of fun wearing them in the East and not in the West because they're unusual here. But anyway, I loved teaching, and I started teaching when I was 20 years old, and I can remember, only thing, my memory of that is just starting off and being so nervous and thinking about it. And I remember a little boy, and his name was Danny, and how that's like I'm 20 and I'm 80, going to be 83 in a week or two. So you think about how much memories mean to you. But he said to me, Miss Kangas, is this your first year of teaching? I said, oh no, I have been teaching for a few years. I thought, oh my goodness, how could any little child know that this is my first year, actually? And he became somebody very special in my life. I just followed his career for a long time too, because so I see him raising his hands, and I said, oh my gosh. And I got a lot of mentorship, which I think is probably why I did a lot of peer work in the field of recovery, because a person that was a little older, and a little older, I was 20 and she was probably 50, so that's not much older, but she came in and she said, you're working too hard at this education thing. She says, the kids know why they're here. You're working hard, just relax. And she said, they'll sit down. You don't have to yell. And I kind of love that whole thing, because I don't think I've ever yelled at all. And I don't think of myself as being an angry person. I just, if you just wait, they will come, kind of thing. And they sat down, and I stayed there for 2 years and had a wonderful career. And then my roommate, who got engaged to somebody from Boston, and then I was dating somebody from Massachusetts as well, and he went to Vietnam. He was a West Point graduate. I said, well, I might was go east too. And so I ended up, our first car, we'd been walking back and forth and taking the bus. And, we were young and it was fun. But I bought a car, and I said, well, okay, we'll come out to Connecticut. And when in those days we were saying, well, let's teach there. Let's see, where would we go? And you're talking about so many years ago, and I'm thinking, when you look at a map, and we didn't have internet and all that kind of stuff. So we looked at the map. And in Massachusetts, there was one town, Boston, and in Connecticut, there was one town, Hartford. And we said, well, why don't we apply at those places? So we applied at Boston, and they said, we're sorry, but we've already picked the teachers for the following year. And Hartford said, oh, we'd love to have you. And so I started my teaching career at Hartford, and then they said to me, the school will be primarily, I don't know that the word was black, but the appropriate word would have been probably that. It's 90% black. And I thought, that's very, and I went by the school when we got here, and we moved to Warehouse Point. We didn't know where we were going. We thought that was a brand new little complex that was kind of nice and all of that. And I went to the school, and the windows broken. It was in North Hartford, and it was in August, and the windows were out, and it was a big, huge school, 2,000 people, 2,000 kids. And I thought, wow, this is going to be and I absolutely adored it. I love teaching. I love teaching in North Hartford. And when I got there, I started teaching in fourth grade, and they started tracking kids in A, B, C, D, and I always like to take the kids that had the most difficulty. I think that's kind of where I've always been. So I took the kids at the bottom. It was like the F group, which many of them couldn't read in the fourth grade. But I just spent a lot of time, and I loved doing that. I also wrote a little book then about, getting kids to get out of their seats, because I didn't believe in this whole thing of they have to stand in rows, because I don't like rows, and I had them being very creative. And I was very unusual as a teacher, too. They kind of looked at my style of teaching, because I thought kids should have choices, and they should be able to talk, and they should be able to do all kinds of things. And so that was a great experience. And also then I met a man that was teaching in the upper grades, and he was from Connecticut, very handsome young man, and he came down to talk to me, and I don't know why, he said, Roger Maris, a baseball player, is from Montana. I said, no, he's from Minnesota. He said, oh my gosh, we talked about it later on in our lives. He said, somebody that knew baseball? He said, wow. I said, no, and because I had gone, my father, and whenever we would travel, we didn't go to see the Statue of Liberty, we went to see Yankee Stadium. I mean, we went to all the places where sports were. When we went to Minneapolis, we went to see the Minnesota Lakers, which then are now in Los Angeles. But so sports were the thing, and the winning and the coaching and the mentoring. I think coaching is very similar to what I kind of do as a teaching. You kind of mentor people along to find their way in life. And I think of how much I believe in the pathways of recovery. So I think I believed in all that pathways of, even in education, finding your way and what makes, and making kids stars and making them stand out for whatever they could do. And it's funny, because when I started in this field, I'd say to kids that were in recovery, and I thought, young people, and I thought, so were you ever like a line leader in school? Most of them had not been. And so I could see why even early on, why kids then turn to drugs and alcohol, or turn to all kinds of things that got them into hospitals and all, because they really didn't have this foundation of being a leader anywhere. And I think that kind of leadership kind of makes people, it's hard then to think about, well, what do you do? Because I'm really not very good at what I do. And so it's easier to kill the pain in another way. But anyway, I stayed in Montana, or then we came out, and so we came out to the East Coast, and I taught here and got married, and I had 2 children. I had a boy, and who became an attorney, and also actually ended up working with me in recovery, which is kind of interesting. And I have a daughter who's still teaching in the town of Glastonbury. I've been teaching for like 28 years or so now, and I think, oh my gosh, these are not young kids anymore. But and I have 3 grandsons, and one of them we're going to see this weekend, because he's getting his he's got a pilot's license in Connecticut, but he's going to become a commercial pilot.
Wow.
And so that's kind of exciting. And the other twin is not so sure. He's kind of they're all athletes. They're all amateur. Well, they've all run in all kinds of races. Certainly in the Manchester races, this was one of the things that they did. I think Thanksgiving is their big race here. But so running and athletics have always stayed a part of my life. But and then I started having, and I remember my first time when I really thought something was kind of wrong. And I think, and when I look at things that my former husband had said about me, he kind of knew that there's some things wrong, because when I take on a project, I'd take on the project, and I did things for, like, I think I did art, for example, and I had pictures, and I did all these things and had them all framed. And of course, when we got divorced, which we did eventually, he said, take your artwork. So I still have my artwork. But and then I would do that. And then when I was pregnant, I made all my maternity clothes. And I just had these, I did things, and I did them to extremes. And I didn't realize that was anything real wrong. But then one day I was teaching, and I called my husband, and I said we were living in Stores. He was getting his, I had gotten my doctorate in Florida, because we had gone down there to teach for a couple of years at some point, and he got his back in Stores. But I said, I think there's something wrong. I said, I can't breathe. And so he called a local doctor, and when I got home, he had waiting for me a shot of bourbon. And I thought, wow. And he said, give her a shot of bourbon. And, right away you start to know that, boy, a shot of bourbon makes you relax, and all of a sudden you can breathe, and you think about, because I've also said to people when I've been speaking about mental health and or addictions, I said, do you think it really works as, having a drink work? And people would say, oh no. And I said, of course it does. I mean, why do people drink at night? Because it's relaxing. They go home and have a glass of wine with their family, and that's fine. It's when, it gets beyond that. And so then I started having more and more issues. And my first hospitalization was in Manchester, not in the hospital, but my dad took me to the head of the psychiatric unit, and he said, oh, I can help you here. And so he started teaching me how to do hypnotism. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is not what I really want to do. And I said, I'm not going to do it. And I put my arms down, and all of a sudden I see my arm going up, and I think, oh my goodness. Power over the mind. And but he also gave me medications, and then it became very high, and I eventually got a diagnosis of at that time was manic depression, which now is called bipolar. And I thought, wow, that was easy. But I thought, and I actually got that diagnosis here, but I thought, I really don't know how to manage it. And one of the things that I really regret, and it's something that I'm starting to write a book about, because I think there should be some education, not just take your medications, but how do you do that? How do you recover? And I know in AA we have NNA and all the AAs, we have lots of groups, and you can go and find out what other people did, but we didn't have much of that. And so to not know what to do, and I kind of felt really like the medication just wasn't enough for me. It wasn't helping it. There's some things that couldn't be taking pills all day, because if I took enough pills to kill the pain, I wouldn't even be able to get out of bed. So I finally said to myself, I think I'm going to go back home to Montana. And so I left, and I had gotten a divorce, and we had joint custody, and that worked out well, because I think my husband, until he died a year ago or so, he married several times more, but we remained friends, and we raised our kids jointly, and certainly both shared in the death of our son, and shared our grandchildren in that. And so I went back, and I went back to Montana, and I was there at home. My father had me painting the house. I painted our house in Montana many times because I had to go home and do that kind of thing. But it made me think about what could I do and where could I go. And my father then took me to one of his doctors, an internist. And the doctor said, the first thing he said to me, which I really think about as a star in what we sometimes do, the doctor looked at me and he said, "You have beautiful blue eyes." I thought, wow, doctors don't say those things. They don't even recognize you as a person sometimes. And I thought, how nice of him to do that. He said, "I want you to trust in me." He said, "I have a friend who was an internist, and now he's a psychiatrist. Would you ever like him to look at you and work with you?" And I thought, yeah, you're a nice guy, so he's got to be a nice guy. I was very positive about all of this. I was not negative at all. And so I got to meet him, and he didn't diagnose me with, let's say, do you have racing thoughts? Do you go to extremes? He said things like, do you have clothes in your closet that have tags on them? I thought, how in the world would you know that? I'm in a white gown here. I'm not in, and that's a kind of a typical thing of being a manic, being shopping and getting all kinds of things. By the way, I still have clothes in my closet that have tags in them. So I don't know that I've really given up that addiction. I'm very careful where I shop. I shop at consignment and that kind of thing. But I do like clothes, and I like putting them together. So I do have clothes that have tags on them, but not as many. But anyway, that was an interesting time to look at that, and then but in those days, and this is why I kind of want to go back to that, because the hospitals were open; they were not locked units. So my mother could come, we could walk to the park together, and I could go to this nurse's station and say, I want to check out. I want to go to the gift shop, of course, but I said I want to check out and get some fresh air, and that was fine. And I think, and then I said, well, I don't think I don't mind telling people that I have manic depression. And I remember this young man saying to me, "You better be careful. That's got a lot of things hanging on it. You don't really want to talk about that." I thought, why? I don't know why not. I'm really happy that I have something I can hold on to. Because I had issues going on, and I didn't know what that was all about. I said, I'm kind of proud of it. He said, I wouldn't be. And so I kind of.
Around what time year was this?
This is like in let's see, I didn't have 1970s, the beginning. It was young in terms of time, and but I think he had lived enough to know that it's not the wonderful thing to have mental illness, and or to have addiction. I mean, it wasn't either one, and so. I thought, oh my goodness. And then so I stayed at home, and I thought, well, I'm not going to come back to Connecticut. And my children were out in Connecticut with their father. He was a superintendent of schools in East Hartford, so all in the vicinity of where we are right now. But I stayed there, and then there was an opening for a principal, and I had the credentials because I had a doctorate and all of that. And so I became a principal of a school in Montana, very near an Indian reservation, which I absolutely loved. I was there on the reservation because I just love to know and find other cultures and all of that. And so I spent a lot of time being on the reservation. I went to church there. I just did a lot of things. I went to all their ceremonies, and the kids really liked me. And I was really surprised because the school was very well endowed because it had a lot of federal money. And I thought, well, where are the pictures on the walls of people that come from the reservation? And I could see that they hadn't integrated it at all, and they did not acknowledge the kids. And I said, but like almost 48% of our student body is from the reservation, and they didn't acknowledge. They were really about their own power. And I thought, wow. But and so I think I'm not sure I was the most popular principal because I said, this has got to change. We've got to endorse the people that we are working with. And so I wanted them to, and I said, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to celebrate it. And that day they called it First American Day. It's really Native American Day in the fall. And they said to me, I don't know what you're thinking. No one's going to come. I said, well, I don't know, maybe. And of course, my father was a coach. And so they had a really great player that my father knew, and they kind of knew a little bit about that. And so the reservation, so the day that people came, they came from, and I got to wear this beautiful Native American costume, and people came from all around, and I thought, wow. And the big issue on the reservation in those days was, and it still probably is for some, is alcohol and substance use, because they do very well, and then all of a sudden they just end up getting offers to go to college, and many times now it's changed, but it hadn't changed then, and people went right back to the reservation and got into the drinking. And I remember a little boy coming into my class, into school, and I was the principal, and he said, I said, "You're so cute." I said, "I'd like to take you home." And I was just I shouldn't have said that, but I didn't think anything of it. And the next day his father came in and he said, "Would you take me too?" And I said, "Oh dear, no, I'm not doing that at all." But so I kind of had to learn that, I'm still young and I'm still thinking about, but I really endorsed, the fact that they were people and they were very important people. And then I remember one of the teachers came to me and she said, "I want to tell you something. I just feel like you're the person I could talk to." I said, "Okay, what did you want to say?" And she said, "I was in a psychiatric hospital." I thought, and by the way, so was I. But I didn't say that then, because the disclosure was would not have been encouraged. And they said, "Did you have any issues when I signed the contract?" I said, "Oh, no, not any issues." And of course there were issues, but disclosure is a hard thing. And I stayed there for a couple of years as a principal, and then I was really struggling with still not knowing exactly how to stay well. And Memorial Day came, and I went to Denver, Colorado, where my sister had lived, and I just bought all kinds of things, and I certainly drank some beer and had a really good time. And I came back really quite disheveled, and they were really kind of discouraged. And so they had a hearing about me, and I brought in an attorney, and the attorney didn't bring in my medical records, and because of that, they couldn't endorse it, because there was no ADA and the things that laws that are protecting people a little bit better. And so I was let go, and I thought, oh my goodness, here I am. Where am I going to go? I have a doctorate in education. I have 2 kids back in in Connecticut, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do. And so I went to Denver, Colorado, and stayed with my sister, and I got really involved, and again my sports came in, because the Denver Broncos were very, very big with John Elway, and they made the Super Bowl and all those kind of things. But I was watching, they had one young man on the team that had psychiatric issues, and they were really kind to him, and I thought that's kind of unusual, and he was getting some help. And so I ended up going to a support group, and it said people with histories of mental illness are encouraged to come and all of that. And I thought, well, I don't know. And I started going, and I went to this support group in Denver, Colorado, and there were 2 doctors there. And I said to the person that I had called, I said, "I thought this was just for us." She said, "Oh, they're us." I said, "Really?" Because I didn't realize that the field of mental health, which includes mental illness and addiction, I thought, wait, it covers everybody. And one doctor said, "Well, yeah, I have, they both had some issues with drugs and alcohol, but they also one had what he called manic depression, and the other one had he said, I have schizophrenia, but I don't believe it." And so knowing these 2 doctors was interesting, because I said, "Well, since you now have to take medication, well, what do you think of all that?" And they said, "Well, we don't like it." I said, "But you were giving it." And they said, "I know, but it's a very different thing when you're taking it." And so there's always been this kind of us and them that we're trying to get together to be us together. And that's a hard thing, because there is this us and them. I take medication, but you don't have to. And so I thought, gee, they were very resident. And then people said to me, "You'd be a very good spokesperson to start talking about recovery." I said, "Well, I couldn't do that." They said, "But I think you could do that." And so they invited me to be a speaker. And I thought, see, that's the beginning of disclosure. And I thought, well, I'll try. And so I did, and it was okay. And then I realized that it was time to come back and see my kids and see what I was going to do, because I don't know that I wanted to live in Colorado. So I came back to Connecticut, and I was looking for a job, and I got a finalist as a principal in Connecticut. That when I came back, I was one of 3 or 4 people, and then I didn't get the job. And then I was looking in the Hartford Current and under administration, because I said, well, that's probably where I belong. And then there was a job that said, a person with a history again, with mental illness is encouraged to apply. And I was at Fairfield Hills Hospital, which is one of our state hospitals that is now closed, and all the things that went on in that area of the state. But I really enjoyed that work too. And there was also the addiction part, and I always kept both of them because I certainly had my use of alcohol, and to the extreme where I actually ended up in rehab. And again in Montana, which is kind of a neat place to go because it was really fun. They didn't give me the best counselors. The best counselors were those in addiction, but they had been in recovery. But I got somebody that hadn't been, but because I wasn't hardcore yet, whatever hardcore was those days. But anyway, but I really loved the addiction treatment. I have to tell you, I still think that's one of the better treatments, other than being locked in a psychiatric unit. I'm not sure that has changed much, and now all units in the country are locked, and I think about having something unlocked, and because why are we punishing? Because I always felt like I must be really bad. And they'd yell at me to get away from the door, and I think, oh, I'm not going to go anywhere. I had no intention of leaving, but I have been hospitalized many, many times, and because my kids didn't know what to do. And so they would just call the ambulance, and the ambulance would come and take me to, I ended up going to Yukon because that's kind of where I was closer to. But again, I never learned much about it except to take medications. And so then I started doing a lot of support groups. When I was working at Fairfield Hills, I had time to do support groups on my own. And I started doing them for mental health, but I noticed that people would come in with both. And I got this idea, and it certainly it's now the thing that really a lot of us are co-occurring. We have both. And which comes first, we're not even sure sometimes, because one leads to another, and we decide. And somebody just called me last night, and they said, I've got a job, possibly interview at CCAR, but I don't know if I should go there. And I said, well, I think you should go there. And she said, well, how can I talk about our class that has all of it? I said, well, CCAR understands that. They're getting into the trauma and all the other things, because you have to get into where does it start, or well, how will it end if you don't know where it started, and what can you do about it? And so I totally believe in all of that. And so I spent a couple of years at Fairfield Hills, and I got to be known as the mentally ill person with keys. And I think of that title, and I think, God, a couple of years ago, I was a principal of a school with a sign that said principal and a nice parking space, and here I am, the mentally ill person with keys. And I have to tell you, when I tell my story, I think the person that I liked the best was the mentally ill person with keys, because it was a wonderful beginning and a wonderful experience to learn and to see what's good and what's not so good, and what can we change. And I thought I was going to stay at Fairfield Hills forever, not knowing that, of course, it's closing. So then people started joining me and saying, I want to meet you. But they didn't want to meet me and go with me. They wanted me to meet them at a restaurant, because they didn't really want to be seen with me, because if they were seen with me, that meant they might have mental health and or addiction, because we kind of went to the and or for a long time. And so we started, and all of a sudden we started getting together, and we said, we really need to do something about all of this. And so our first advocacy movement was really strong. There's only like 8 or 9 of us that got together. We said, we need somebody at the commissioner's level. And I said, well, I don't even know anything about the commissioner's level. And I said, well, yes, that's in Hartford, and we need somebody there to be at the table. Why are they making decisions about us without us? And that's our big saying, nothing about us without us. And so I said, well, and I wasn't any more destined to do it than anybody else. And they said, well, you're probably the one to do it, because you have the doctorate and you have a lot of experience, and you've had a lot of life experience in terms of education, and you kind of know. So we'd like to encourage you. So we were going to march and picket on the commissioner's lawn, who lived in New Haven. His Dr. Albert Solnit, who no longer is living, but he was an international psychiatrist as well. And actually, he was my age at that time, which is really strange. I said, how can anybody work to be 83? I thought, oh my gosh, that's really old. And here I am today at that age. And I thought, and then there was a deputy commissioner there, and she had her own kind of issues, I think. I think a lot of people had, and just didn't talk about them. And we were getting ready to march on a Sunday, and then we told them, we said, we're going to march. We got permission from the New Haven police, and the media was going to come, because can you imagine what that's going to be like with people with mental health issues and addiction issues? And we really didn't have many people. I said, I don't know, we got to get more people. So I got really involved with the disability community. And so I got people in wheelchairs and people that I knew really well. I really admired their movement, because they were really strong. They would put themselves in, they'd take their wheelchair and tie it to the back of a bus, because again, buses were not handicap accessible. And I thought, well, I really admired their courage. I said, well, we got to be along the lines of them, because they started the ADA, and they actually didn't want us to join. They were not so happy about anybody joining, because their disabilities sometimes were more visible than ours. We could hide ours. And I was really pleased, and they were all going to come with us and march on that Sunday. And I got a call on Friday and said, oh, so Karen, when do you want to start at DEMAS? At the Department of Mental Health. It wasn't DEMAS then, it was just Department of Mental Health. And I said, well, May 1st would be okay. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. So I thought, that's a good thing. So I got to the department. It's on Washington Street. I'm now working on right off Washington Street at IOL. So I haven't changed much in my career in terms of location. But I got in there and nobody would talk to me. I said, oh, this is going to be fun. Nobody's going to talk to me. And the HR person was right across the hall. And he just kept looking, because, I didn't apply and go through the process of interviewing and all of that. And he said, I thought, oh dear, this is not, and I wasn't really trying to, but no one would talk. And I thought, this is not going to be fun. So I got an old-fashioned girdle from Gone with the Wind. And I put it up on behind my wall, because, I was an elementary school teacher, and you had to decorate your walls. And I said, when all else fails, hold it together. And people went by my office, and I could hear them down the end of the hallway. Oh my gosh, she needs more medication. She needs more medication. And they still were like, but it came, just, quietly and gently, and I'd go home crying, but I said, they kept saying, we're with you. We're gonna do something here. And so it wasn't, then finally it was getting a little tiny bit better, and so I thought, well, maybe I should join them in terms of even dress. So I bought a navy blue suit, very, very conservative, not me at all, and I walked into a meeting, and there were 30 people in the office, and the commissioner was there, and he said, Karen, are you all right? I said, yeah, I'm fine. I said, why are you asking? And he said, well, look at you. I thought, oh dear, here I am looking like all of you, and you're not going to accept that. And I thought, well, and let me just tell you, I threw the navy blue suit away and have not worn one since, because, in fact, I don't wear navy blue. I just think, oh my goodness, I don't wear conservative things. And I thought, well, I've got to be who I am, and then I guess that's what I'm thinking, and that seems to be the best way to go. But, and it kept getting better and better, and then I got people that came in, closed the door. I always had closed doors behind me, because they were telling me their story. And then they said, I kind of like to come and work with you. And then they kind of accused me of looking, and I wasn't really knowing what I was going to be doing. And I started writing jobs. And the first job that I wrote for people in recovery was one, and the topic that I used when I went around the state, and I was asked to speak all over the state, I would use hope and recovery, because I always thought that was really missing, the hope part and the recovery part, that you can do it no matter where you've been. If you and certainly accepted people that had been in prison for selling drugs and all that. I still do. It's just part of what happened in life, and you always can grow from that. And so it was a really interesting thing that we just in the course of, I finally made it to the commission. Remember, we moved to Capitol Avenue, and I actually got a position on the commissioner's staff. I was the director of recovery, but whenever they would talk about people, they'd all look at me, and I think, God, you're looking the wrong way, because I had then known that there was a couple other people that took much more medication than I did, had much more addiction than many people who had addiction issues, but they weren't going to talk about them because they didn't need to, and it wasn't encouraged.
How do you feel it is now compared to, as you tell your story, I hear there's a lot of hiding. There's a lot of kind of closed door. There's a lot of just not sharing and being open. And I feel like now we hear a lot more about people speaking on their addiction, speaking on their mental health. Do you notice a shift since when you started?
There is a shift, but it's still not big enough. I mean, I look at Hartford Healthcare, and I know because people have told me their story behind, and they don't use it. One person said to me, and he had a DUI, and he said, when we get into our leadership, I'm on the leadership at behavioral health and at Hartford Healthcare now, and he said, I'm going to tell my story. He never did. I think he was encouraged not to. Quite honestly, I think the leaders are encouraged not to. And so I remember a doctor that I really got to know very well, who certainly had co-occurring and he said, Karen, he said, I've got to make my career, I've got to write. I'm not sure that's going to be part of my story, but I said, but it is your story too. He said, but it's just not okay. But it is getting better. I'm not.
I think that goes to show it is okay also, right?
Yes.
Because you're showing that there's so many people in positions of power, so many people who are in leadership roles, so many decision makers who are really just like everyone else.
Right.
And there's something underneath, the onion layers you got to peel back, and there's something that's being hidden.
Well, I actually think that probably most of our major people that run all these companies have. Certainly, I look at certainly both, because I always think of, I don't know anyone today really very much that has bipolar, for example, that doesn't use something, because the pain of it is not easy. And when medication doesn't work that fast, drugs and alcohol work much faster. I mean, the drugs that you buy that just go right into your system, right into the veins, and it works. But they don't. I think that they're at the top because I think they have the energy to be there. I think we have a lot of energy and we have a lot of courage, because we fought a lot of battles here to get there. And so we kind of overlook the discrimination and say, I can be there, but then I don't want to go back there. I don't want to be. And then I think there's also the fear that, what if I relapse? I'm going to make the papers, and they do. That's the unfortunate part, when they relapse, which is really sad, because it's kind of something. I remember asking a deputy commissioner that we had. I said, well, when we do this addiction conference, I said, can we have something on relapse? And he said, absolutely not. I said, but why? That's part of the process, possibly. I said, it isn't it isn't certainly something that you have to do, but I mean, if it happens, they should know. And I think one of my sad stories in all of this was a young man that I just absolutely loved, and he said, Karen, you never remember my drug of choice. And I said, well, it's and he said, no, you don't remember it if it's what it is. But he said, I just want you to, I really appreciate that you stopped by. He was working at CVH, and then one day he wasn't there, and I thought, I wonder where he is. And people went to look for him, and I think the shame of relapsing. This was years ago, not today. And he died. And I think, wow, why are we not talking about what could or could not happen, and how do we come back from? And when I was at Demas, I was hospitalized, and I have to tell you, the commissioner was really great. He'd call me not to ask me about work, just to say, are you okay, and what can you do? We're looking for you to come back, and all of that. So I think it's better that way. I mean, he really was upset when I said I wanted to retire. And I don't know why I wanted to retire, but I really didn't retire. In fact, he wrote this story that said she'll never retire, and I really have.
Seems like you're a teacher for life. You're always going to be learning and teaching in some capacity.
I love it. I just think it's fascinating, and so then I didn't retire. I left Demas, but then it was Demas. And then he then said to me, when I was working there, the commissioner, he said, I think you should report to the deputy, because he's coming from what house? Liberation. He worked at Liberation. He said, you like addiction, so I think I'm going to have you kind of stick there, because they're coming in new here. And I thought that was fine, and I liked him a lot. And in fact, he became the commissioner, and so we became good friends, because then he talked a little bit without really saying he had been drinking at one point, but I know that he probably had.
But you seem very ahead of your time, like just from when everything happened, you knew this is okay.
It's okay.
This is part of the human experience.
Right.
This is your human experience. I have my own. We all have our own.
Right.
And we can't hide it. It's like when you walking into the room with everyone wearing the suits and everyone's used to you wearing your outfit. Wear your own outfit. Wear your own sparkle. Be your own person.
And I think I got to, but look at the age I am, and I'm trying to say to young people, it's okay. You can be who you want to be. You can be the person that called me and said, well, I want to go to CCAR. I said, well, then go to CCAR. I said, and she said, well, they're going to ask me why CCAR and why recovery coach. And I said, well, if one of the main things that you fought for and fought for in your own life is addiction, the real addiction. And she said, it is. And I said, well, then that's okay. What, you could also bring to that field a little bit of the mental health and the holistic. I said, actually, they're doing the holistic. One of my friends is doing a sound healing there all the time. And she said, oh, good. And so I really encourage them to find their own way and be wherever they are. In fact, one of my people that I just absolutely love came to Root as a result of my knowing Pat and Steve a little bit. And he liked it at Root a lot. But he kind of wanted to move up the ladder too, and people do. They kind of get themselves thinking. Yeah. So he went to harm reduction, which was not a good choice for him in some ways. It ended badly. And it ended with him losing his life. Mm-hmm. So, I was there at the day of the funeral, and there were many, many clients that came from Root, as well as from Hartford Healthcare, as well as a lot of administrators coming, because he was really well liked. But I think, the thing that we have to guard against is he'd had a lot of losses. And sometimes and he started using when he was in high school, and his father was a head professor at UConn. But it had, an opportunity to go to UConn. Actually, you can go there if your parent is a professor for no cost. And he said, I just started using, and he said, I was on the streets. And then his mother is now my really good friend, and she said, people keep saying it was the dirty drugs that killed my son. She said, but I know it wasn't. And I said, I know it too. She said, I'd like to have you be my friend and come talk with me, because you understand that John had too many losses. And the losses keep building up. And that's what, and all of a sudden there's that loss. And what am I going to do? I've lost this, I've lost that. And what is the mind thinking? What makes it easier? It's just to make it go away. And so that's why lots of people start using it again, because I want this to go away. I want this pain to go away. I want this life to go away. In that minute, now had somebody been there and walked him through that and said, let's go have some coffee, let's talk about this, isn't there another way? But sometimes there isn't always that person. And I think that's probably why I'm really dedicated to training people that are peers, because they have that feeling of, they can almost feel when somebody's really reaching a point in his life or her life and saying, I think I need to spend some more time, because we're not limited like clinicians to so much time. We can spend a little more time.
Well, it seems like it's all about having the conversation too.
Absolutely.
It's it's bringing awareness, but it's having the conversation. It's being willing to ask somebody how they're doing. It's being willing to speak about how you're doing.
Right. And saying, and one of the things that we're not talking about, which my psychiatrist never ever asked me, did you ever have a suicide attempt? He never asked. I had a very serious suicide attempt, very serious. When I left education and went home, I said to my daughter, you think that I didn't lose my job? I said, I just went home. I went home to die. I said, it'd better die in Montana where my parents could bury me than out here. And she was like shocked. I said, but I did. I tried. I tried taking all kinds of medications and all these things. And I laid down and wrote my letter and said, dear God, I'm sorry. I can't do this anymore. I can't have this pain, and I don't know what to do with it. And I keep getting better, and then I don't get so. Then something happens, and I go right back to old patterns. And but somehow I didn't put the right ingredients into them, because I got sick of it. And all of it came up. And so no one really knew. If I didn't talk about it, no one would have even known. But
no one would still know if you weren't here sitting with me and telling everybody else that you've told.
No, I did. I wrote all the letters to my kid. I wrote to my kids, and I said, I'm really sorry. I can't do it anymore. I thought they probably won't really understand, but I just have to say it. It's enough. I've had enough.
But how heavy, too, that you carried that, and that there's so many other people who are carrying it.
Yeah, they do. And so that's why I'm really glad that we're opening up about, let's talk about it. So you're thinking about it, So that's not wrong. That's a okay thing in life to think. Well, yeah, maybe the world would be better, and I'd be better off without. Maybe my family would be better off without my, you know, um, and so we don't talk about it, and it's not like well the end of the we don't necessarily. In fact, we talk about it in class a lot. We don't necessarily you don't necessarily have to go to the hospital. You have to think about and then one of the things that my colleague always says is when people tell me that, I make sure that at the end I'm feeling good about it. Because if I'm not feeling good about it, I might tell somebody. I might do something more than that.
Yeah.
But it depends on. And one of the things they always ask us is, do you have a method? We all have a method. If I wanted to die today, I could die today. I mean, it's not so hard to do that. In fact, I actually went to a conference once with ways that people suicide, and I thought, oh my God, this is fun to be here. But I learned a lot about it. I thought that's kind of an interesting thing, but I don't think they would do that today only because.
But you're poking holes in it. You're demystifying it. You're showing people the reality of it.
Yes.
That it's not something that we need to. And obviously, it is something we need to take seriously because
Yes.
it's something we want nobody to encounter.
Right.
But to talk about people have had thoughts. People, may have a plan in their mind, but not one that they want to execute. But telling people that it's not that it's normal, but there's a normalcy to it that it happens to people.
I like the way that you put that there's a normalcy to it, because if you have all of this pain and people are looking at you and people have all said when I was not and I can remember going to an AA meeting, and I heard one of the people that actually was the pharmacist in the town. I shouldn't have known that, but I did know that. And he said, oh, I was so manic. Oh my God. And I thought, oh, that's good. He's saying the word manic. So I went up to him afterwards. I said, so you have manic depression? Oh no, I'm not crazy. And I'm thinking, well, people that I know, including myself, that get high on whatever they get high on, you're a little bit crazy, whatever that might mean. And so it's not. And for a long time, I didn't like the word crazy. I said, that really defines, but it really doesn't. It just finds situations that are unusual. It's nothing permanent, and people are not being mean.
Well, because look at you sitting here now. I mean, with this accomplished story that you're telling me, and the places you've been, the people you've met, the rooms you've been in.
Yeah, right.
There's nothing crazy about that.
No.
I mean, if anything, it's crazy because so few people get to walk in the shoes that you've walked in.
And one of the things that I didn't share was that I got to do a lot of I got to do a lot of national things. I went down to SAMHSA a lot. They really encouraged me at Demas because I was representing Connecticut. So I got to go down there, and all my vacation time, I got paid from SAMHSA, but I took vacation time, and I got to go all over the country, and I got to see things and hear things and meet people, and so when I think about Portland, Oregon, it was on the news this morning. I was in Portland. I loved Portland, and we had a great time there, and so there are people everywhere. We're the same kind of everywhere. We can, and I get invited to something in California all the time. I don't know where they got the name, but and so what my course right now is, it's a virtual course because I have been able to ask people around the country would they do a video for me. So I've asked people that are professional, that have done really great work. I have somebody that did trauma. He did 2 hours of a video just on trauma, and he certainly talked about the results of addiction and mental health on that whole field, and he talked about it in a way though, but he also said some things that he probably wouldn't want anybody to hear because he was talking to us as people in recovery, what we could do and what we could think about, and the trauma is very real.
Very,
very real, and some of it, and it's not what happened, because people have things that are horrible and they seem to walk away, but what happened in here it hurts.
Everybody processes it differently.
Absolutely.
And Karen, I know we've talked about a lot, and I've kept you here, and I could keep interviewing you all day. You have a very interesting story. Is there anything you feel that we haven't talked about that you've left out that you think is important to mention?
I'm trying to think. I don't think so, because I think there's this whole thing that we have to still keep going, and we still have to have people that are willing to talk about it as part of who they are. And sometimes people say it in a way, they'll say, well, I'm the CEO of something, but I'm also someone in recovery. And sometimes they don't even hear that anymore. So it's getting better. It is. There was a legislator that I just loved, And his big thing was he was in recovery. And I still talk to him, and he's no longer there. He's older now, but I think so. I love the courage. I always think, thank goodness you're doing that. And I always write a little note to people that are willing to do that, because it's really important that they're advancing the field, because they're saying, and I have that too, and it's okay. It's okay. Be saying it's okay doesn't mean it doesn't hurt and it's not painful, and we don't need help, and we don't need the best of help. And we look at the places, and people say to me, well, where would you have us go? Some people call me all the time, where should I go? And I look at where they live and what's there for them, but it really isn't the building and all of that. It's the people that are there that care.
Finding your connection and
Finding the
community.
connection is number one. We talk about connection. You got to be connected, because when you're all alone, that's when it's dangerous, kind of, for people.
Well, I
At
can
any
tell
age.
you have no problem connecting with people, Karen. That is not an issue of yours.
Well, I don't know. Sometimes I spend a lot of time alone, but I kind of like my alone time too, because
We got to have a good
Yeah.
blend of both.
yeah, a little bit of both. So
Well, Karen, thank you so much for being here this morning. It
Thank
was a
you.
pleasure chatting with you.
thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast, Recovery with Root. As always, stay connected with us on social media to learn about when next podcast episodes will drop. You can comment, ask questions, even let us know about future topics that you'd like to see discussed. Until next time, remember, progress is the destination.